I'm going to be talking about WEIRDS, which is maybe not an acronym you're familiar with, so I'll expand it for you. It stands for Web Extensible Internet Registration Data Service. The web is sometimes replaced with worthwhile for reasons I'll get to in a minute. For me, the worthwhile bit is probably the most important part of the whole acronym, and I'll talk about that later. So what is WEIRDS? Well, the first thing is it's a replacement for Whois. And I'm sure everyone in this room has used Whois at some point to find out who has a control of an IP address assignment, a domain name, something like that. It improves upon Whois by adding some things that a lot of people have been asking for a long time. Some things that have been added on an ad hoc basis on particular systems and services which have never been standardized. And WEIRDS is going to try and bring those additional features in an interoperable way so that clients of all services can have access to them. WEIRDS uses a RESTful model, which I'll explain later. It's web-friendly. It supports a structured data model, so it can be presented in different formats. It provides differentiated access to different clients. So there's a difference between an anonymous user and an authenticated user and what they can do. And it's fully internationalized, so users can access the data in their own language. So I want to talk a little bit about Whois before we go on to WEIRDS. Whois is one of the very oldest application protocols still in widespread use on the internet. As you can see from the top of the RFC, the first RFC that defines Whois, dates to 1982, which is probably before some of the people in this room were born. I checked, and number one at the time was Don't You Want Me by the Human League. So we're well into the era of the 80s. So there are some problems with Whois, and I'll go through them. The first, most obvious thing is that it's completely open. As I say, there's no differentiated access. Anyone can query anything. That's resulted in all kinds of problems. It's a perfect example of a protocol that was designed in an era where the network, or the ARPANET at the time, was completely open and benign. So there were no bad guys anywhere. It's a slightly different operating environment now. That openness has a lot of negative consequences. If you're a domain name registrant, and there are 240 million of them nowadays, you don't particularly want to get spammed or phished. You use a privacy service. Most registrars will offer a private registration of some form or another, which makes Whois records more or less useless because they're full of junk. And paradoxically, it actually makes things easier for the spammers and phishers who you're trying to defend yourself against, because they use the same services, and it's just as bad for the anti-abuse people trying to get after them as it is for the bad guys to get after you. The original Whois specification was never designed to be machine readable. It actually says right there in the first draft, it's designed for being read by a human being. That means that there are literally thousands of different formats for Whois records in the .com and .net namespace, where you have thin registration, and registrars run their own Whois servers. They each have their own implementation, they each have their own flavor, and if you're an anti-abuse person or just a general kind of developer wanting to reliably get Whois information out from one of the 140-odd million common net domains, it's kind of a dice roll as to whether you're going to get it in a format you can work with. The original Whois specification lacks any sort of redirection or discoverability, so we have to hand maintain lists of Whois servers and the namespaces they answer for. It's probably okay when the list of TLDs is relatively small and doesn't change very much, but in the next couple of years there are going to be thousands of new TLDs, and it will become very hard to find the right Whois server for the TLD you're trying to query for. And finally, Whois is not internationalized in any way. So there's no encoding specification, and there's no support for internationalized or localized data. So if you're a Chinese registrant of a .cn domain name, you go to your local Chinese registrar in the Chinese language, you register a Chinese IDN domain name, and when you're asked to put in the contact information, you've got to transcribe it into ASCII so it can appear in Whois, because ASCII is the only safe format to put data into Whois with. All those problems have been raised, and we've known about them for many years. So a question you might reasonably ask is 2012, why are we only now getting round to trying to fix them? The answer is that we did try. We tried it back in the noughties and we failed, and the failure was called IRIS. It was the Internet Registration Information Service, Internet Registry Information Service. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the upshot was that it was too complicated to implement. It used an exotic bleeding-edge transport protocol called BEEP, which I think was Blocks Exchange something protocol, which was so bleeding-edge that when developers came to write implementations on clients and servers, there were no off-the-shelf libraries they could use, so they just throw their hands up and said, oh, we'll go and do something else more useful. We were quite lucky at Centralnic at the time. One of our senior developers had just come out of university and had done his master's on BEEP, so we did have an implementation. But apart from us, VeriSign and DNIC, the German country code registry, there were no server deployments, and I'm not aware of any client deployments at all other than those published by the registries who wanted to test their own systems. This is why the worthwhile part of WEIRDS' name is probably the most important, because we need a system that's easy to implement, one that a sysadmin with a bit of Perl and some bash scripting can work with, or a junior developer can take and embed in a web page. Fortunately, there are a lot of people who agree with me, and following some work done at ARIN and some discussion in the RIR and the registry worlds, the WEIRDS working group was chartered back in April of this year, and one of the mantras was keep it simple, stupid, because we don't want to go down the iris route again. So moving forward, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the details of WEIRDS. I said before it's RESTful. For those of you who don't read Hacker News, REST is an acronym for Representational State Transfer. It's an application design paradigm that reuses the grammar and syntax of the web. The World Wide Web is itself a RESTful application. That means that HTTP is the underlying transport for WEIRDS. That means you can write clients in curl and wget, or you can use the libraries that exist in your preferred programming language. It reuses HTTP's request and response semantics, so there are no new error codes to learn. 200 means OK, 404 means not found, 301 means go somewhere else. Everything in WEIRDS is a URI, and references between objects are expressed as URI relationships. Because your objects are URIs, there will be standard URI patterns that make it easy to address known objects. Here's some examples taken from the current drafts. You can see both names and numbers represented in this list, where you've got an IP address, autonomous system, a domain name, and an entity, which might be a contact object that may be associated with any of the three above. How do I go back? There we go, yeah. Because we're using HTTP, we get differentiated access because there are various different ways of authenticating user agents. And HTTP supports internationalisation, so we can state a preference for character encoding a language. And finally, HTTP obviously lets us do redirection. Okay. I said that we can have differentiated access. That means that we might only show basic registration data about domain names to anonymous users, but provide more detailed information to people we have a contract with, whose usage of the data we can regulate. In the GTLD world, there are various features of Whois which are not available unless you are signed up to, for example, a searchable Whois system. And the only way to access data is through a direct query using the anonymous interface if you don't have that contractual arrangement. There are different authentication mechanisms, so we can use username and password in HTTP authentication, or we can use an SSL certificate. SSL certificate's quite handy because if you're running a Whois server and you have a contractual obligation to allow additional extra access to third parties that you don't have control over those third parties, then whoever decides who gets access, for example, ICANN, might simply sign their certificates and you just trust what's at them if they're signed by ICANN. So moving on, structured data. Again, Whois originally is just all plain text. Some people have standardized on name value fields or sort of indentation of various kinds, but there's no standard format for it. The details haven't been settled yet, but the consensus seems to be moving towards JSON as the default, and with XML as an optional extra, and there'll be rules about transforming between one and the two. JSON's good for embedding data into web pages. The web browser can directly query the server via AJAX without needing a proxy on the web server. Having structured data format also allows for extensions. So different registries can extend a small set of common fields with those required by their own policy. So obviously, if you're a CCTLD registry, there are maybe some things you have to put in the Whois because of the local legislation that that a GTLD registry can't, or vice versa. HTTP gives us redirection, so we can follow the chain of delegation or assignment. And the examples I've got here are from the IANA, which is the ultimate source of both names and numbers, to the RIR or registry as appropriate. And in the case of a thin Whois, like CommonNet, there can be an additional redirection down to the registrar. That means no hard-coded lists of names of Whois servers or weird servers to talk to. Finally, internationalisation. Whois is almost useless to the majority of English users for whom English and Latin script are meaningless. But with WEIRDS, clients can ask for records in the appropriate encoding and potentially language. Some registries support internationalised and localised contact information, for example. So if you're English, you can get a transliterated version of a Chinese address. If you're Chinese, you get the actual native address. So where are we now? One of the first registries to look into this area was ARIN, who created the Whois RWS service. This service already handles more query volume than their port 43 Whois, which is pretty astonishing when you think that the old protocol has been around for 30 years. The new port 43 system has probably only been around, port 80 system has only been around for about a year, and already the majority of consumers have already switched to the HTTP service. There aren't many other protocols that you see adoption that quickly, given the number of established clients for the old protocol. VeriSign have also created a test bed for the CCTLDs they operate. They can't run it for common net and name because ICANN has to give their approval on that. But you can go to the VeriSign DNRD AP service and do a RESTful lookup on domains in .cc and .tv and so on. And Centralnic will probably have a testbed implementation before the RFCs are published as well. So here's the timeline for the development of the standards. The number of people, numbers people, that's the IRs and so on, are working a bit quicker than the names people. The intention is to have a standard that works for both. The reason is that really that there are only 5 RIRs. It's quite easy to get some sort of consensus between them. But there are hundreds of name registries, each of which have their own unique local, national jurisdictions and legislation. And getting consensus is just a little bit harder. But the intention is to have RFCs for both names and numbers published by the end of next summer. And you can see the timeline says we should have a draft, at least for the names, for RFC for the response format by August next year. There are some challenges and some risks to this work. Finding common ground between names and numbers is important because we need to show commitment on the name side to avoid falling behind of the numbers people. We don't want to be in a situation where we have like a 2-tier or a 2-speed protocol where numbers people rush ahead and finish their work well before we do, and when we try and integrate what they've done into what we're doing, we find that it's incompatible and you end up with 2 standards rather than 1. Name registries have a lot of contractual and regulatory restrictions. As I say, country code TLDs often have to deal with governmental intervention, legislation and regulation, and they need to be accounted for. We have to be careful to put WEIRDS in what I call a Goldilocks zone, where it's open enough to be adapted, to allow it to be adapted to lots of different use cases and different registry policies, but not so open that you end up with interoperability problems. And I've been involved in something called EPP, which is kind of struggled to stay within that zone where you do have a lot of incompatibilities between different implementations. And of course, there's the usual challenge of herding cats at the IETF. So I'm going to conclude by encouraging you to get involved if you're interested. The mailing list is on the screen there. Please read the drafts. They're not that difficult to read. I mean, I can read them, so I'm sure you can. Please offer feedback. And if you're a producer or a consumer of Whois data, especially in the anti-abuse world or law enforcement, then please give us your input. Thank you.